So, up until now, we have described natural selection as really the only mechanism for evolution. However, it does turn out that sometimes we can have evolution or a change in allele frequency that is not based on natural selection. It's based more on random factors in the environment that happen. So, that's what we're looking at today. As we've said before, where natural selection is at work, the adaptive traits are going to be favored in an environment that increases fitness and therefore increases ability to reproduce. But as I was just saying, sometimes there can be evolution without natural selection happening. It's actually not dependent on their traits. It's based more on actually just a random change that happens in the environment. So we call that genetic drift. So just to kind of reiterate, genetic drift is still leading to evolution. It is another mechanism for evolution. And within genetic drift, we're going to talk about a few different examples that are included with genetic drift, I should say. But what it also causes is the change in allele frequencies. Okay. So again, it's not based on whether a trait is adaptive or not adaptive. It's now based simply on essentially being in the right place at the right time. So, a couple of things about genetic drift as a general sort of mechanism. One is that it applies only to very small populations. It does not apply to large populations. We'll see why in just a second. It's caused by random events, so it is not predictable by the same principles that we could use for natural selection. The change in allele frequencies also changes the phenotype ratios of the population, which we're going to see in just a second. And there's lots of different examples of it. So I want to give you just an example of, again, just generally genetic drift. Thinking about like a bug population, the green and the brown bugs start off as a population of about 1/3 green and about 2/3 brown. Now, why I've chosen this particular diagram is because neither of these bugs is like more advantageous than the other one. So being green is not better than being brown. In terms of like the gray background, it's all sort of equal. Okay. Now, what happens over time is that this person comes by and just accidentally steps on them. So, again, not based on their traits, not based on their color or their size. And so we call that random event that changes the population, we call that genetic drift. So in the kind of final population, we end up with 1/7 green and 6/7 brown. It's not because the brown ones have a more adaptive or more beneficial trait. It's just because they so happened randomly not to get stepped on. So to show that in sort of like a more simplified way, over here I have, let's call these just individuals, but in these individuals I have about 1/4 of each in a population. Genetic drift is allowed to happen. So there's some random event. In this scenario, what I would usually do in school is that we would just pick out of a bag these different shapes. Okay, so in doing that, I'm not necessarily going to get equal proportions of each. I'm actually going to get a change in the frequency. And that change in the frequency is evolution. Okay, so in the end population, I might have these different things. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of genetic drift. The first one is genetic bottleneck. And the reason it's called this is we can imagine that there's a population of organisms inside the bottle. And when we pour it out, essentially there is a drastic reduction or a huge decrease in population size. So this original or parent population, let's say that it's 50-50 of blue and yellow spheres or beads, let's call them. And when I dump them out, I get just whatever ones survive, so to speak. Okay, so these surviving individuals, that's going to be a different frequency. So even just looking at it briefly, I can see that it's not 50-50 anymore. It's probably about 20% yellow and the other 80% blue. So if those beads or those organisms are allowed to reproduce, they create then a whole population in the next generation or several generations later that has a totally different frequency. It's not 50-50 yellow and blue anymore. I have now a disproportionate amount of blue. So the reason I'm saying this is that essentially in this population, we've had evolution. We've had a change in frequency. It's no longer 50-50. And a good example of this is that about 12,000 years ago, there was a mass extinction event. They think it's caused by like a huge natural disaster that has happened. And about 8 cheetahs survived this event. Okay, so again, event happens beyond the control of natural selection, and we have only 8 individuals left. So these 8 individuals have what we call a very small gene pool. There's a very small number of individuals to actually contribute genes from. So of those eight actually do reproduce. But today, 12,000 years later, we see that it's a very small difference in DNA between each of them. And so, unfortunately, cheetahs are like very, very, how should I put this? Very unhealthy population. Okay, so they are very susceptible to disease. They die really early, and so forth and so forth. So, unfortunately, this mass extinction event for them was actually not beneficial, but they were able to grow their population again. So, that's the first example of genetic drift. The second one is called the founder effect. And this is like less sort of disastrous, let's call it. But what happens is a small group of individuals will move to sort of a separated location. They will essentially found a new colony. So, very similar to what we talked about with like Darwin's finches. A bunch of these organisms will just go to an island. Now, we're assuming that this has nothing to do with their actual traits or their actual abilities to fly somewhere, but a small group of them go to a new place. They form a new colony, which has whichever new population. So, in my example here, if only red ones happen to go over there, well, they're going to repopulate, but now the frequency is very different. So over here, where we have like maybe 50-50 with yellow and red, now in the new island, we have all 100% red. Okay, so again, we call this evolution because we do have a change in frequency when we're comparing the ancestral or original population with the new population. So founder effect is also an example of genetic drift. We are assuming it has nothing to do with natural selection. It has nothing to do with having some type of favorable trait. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with here is because if you plan to take genetics in the future, one thing that we use often is the Hardy-Weinberg principle. I'm not going to test you on it in grade 11 and not even in grade 12 will you really talk about it much. But what I wanted to, why I put it here and why I wanted to talk about it a little bit is that we can use a mathematical equation to essentially predict the allele frequencies of certain things in a population. And that's called the Hardy-Weinberg principle. So this assumes that the allele frequencies are in a very large population will remain constant. And this actually does assume that no evolution is happening. Okay, so we have a couple of variables in here. The P is the frequency of the dominant allele. So let's say that was like 0.5 or 50%. The Q is the frequency of the recessive allele. So let's say that that was also 0.5%. So this is a mathematical relationship that if you knew the frequency of one of them, you could figure out the frequency of the other one. And that represents 100% of the population. So the reason I show this is to say that when you're actually studying evolution and when you're actually studying populations, even in biology, there's a lot of math behind it. There's a lot of making predictions. There's a lot of frequencies like we saw in genetics as well. So what this Hardy-Weinberg assumes, though, is that the population is not changing. And so for that to happen, the allele frequencies will need to stay the same. So this assumes no natural selection, no mutation, no migration, a very large population size, and then also random mating. So in reality, in real life, we know that this is not true, okay? But this is a very close approximation that someone has come up with to describe allele frequencies in a population. So again, for this one here, I'm not going to be like testing you on it or anything like that. I really just like to put it here so that it introduced to you that there is a mathematical way to understand evolution within a population. So again, this one here, don't worry as much, but if you take it in the future, you'll be able to do some calculations with it.